Hello, my name is Medhat Elmasry, and today's lesson is on using Express with MongoDB. So let's get started. First thing I want to do is create a directory where I'm going to build my application. I'm going to create a folder in here. Let me go to the command prompt, and I'm going to call it Express Mongo. And I'll go to that directory, and in here I'm going to initialize an app by going npm init. I'm going to just take the default. Okay. Now for this app I need some packages. I have created some snippets here. So as you can see, the packages that I need to install are Express, Body Parser, EJS, EJS locals, MongoJS, and of course I want to save it locally. Now what Body Parser allows me to do is to submit forms. That's essentially what it does. So in one command I'm going to install all 5 packages. I'm going to copy this and paste it here. Go on and install for me these packages. And it did it pretty quickly. Now, I want to start my Visual Studio code, so I'm going to type in code dot. And in here, we have our node modules with all the packages installed. We have our package.json. Now, one change I'm going to do is I'm going to open the package.json, and here the main file is indicated as being index.js. I'm going to change this to server because I'll be creating another file called server.js, and that's going to be my main app. So now I can close this. I want to create a configuration file where I'm going to put my database connection string. So I will be creating a new folder here, and I'll call it config. And in this config folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'll call it index.js. Now we know that any file that takes the name index.js happens to be the default. In this file, I'm going to use... Now, I have here 2 connection strings. One is a connection string that will go against Mongo Labs, and this is the format for that connection string. You have to replace this with your username and this with your password, and then there would be a unique host that you need to pick up from Mongo Labs. This other connection string here would point to a local database, but the application will be using a connection string that it will find by entering config.database. So if we want to use the local database, I will just rename this to anything else, like let's say mlab, and I will remove this here if I want to use the local database. I just left it this way. We'll start off by talking to a local database. Now, I have already started my local MongoDB, and I did create in there a database called InstituteDB, and I already added some students in there that will help us later on. Now, this here is important. The port number that we're going to be using, if there is already an environment variable called port, it's going to take that. Otherwise, it's going to take 3000. And this is because when you deploy this into a production environment, you want it to take on port 80. But in our development environment, we prefer to use port 3000. The next step is let's create our server.js file. Now I have a snippet for that. I'm going to copy all of this and paste it in my server.js file. These are the packages that we're going to be using: Express, body parser to start with. Because I'm going to use the path to reference static files, I'm going to import the path library, and this is built into Node. I will eventually have a routes folder. So while we're at it, let us create it. I'm going to create a new folder here, and I'm just going to call it routes. And this is going to point to the default routes JavaScript file. In reality, I don't even need to enter this here because it will default to index in any case. So now that we know that we need an index file there, let me actually create these two files: index.js, and if we go back to server.js, we need another file called students.js. Let me add that before I forget it. Next, I'm going to also import my config settings, and my config settings, I already created them. Here you're getting a handle to the Express engine. With these three lines of code, you're specifying that the view engine is going to be EJS. Now, we're going to put some static content in a folder called client. This keyword is used in Node to point to the fully qualified name of the directory that is the root directory of this website. So this one actually converts into a fully qualified file system name. So it's going to join the fully qualified file system name to the word client, which means that we need to have another folder here called client. Here we're going to use body parser to parse JSON objects and also to parse form data. Now here we're going to listen on the config port. The config port would be what we saved in the index.js file in the config folder, and this is this one here, port. So I'm going to listen on that port number, which will either be the environment variable port that may have been set in the operating system, or 3000. And then it would display a message saying server started on port and so. Let me go now and build my index.js file. And my index.js file, it is going to use the router function in Express, and it's going to set a route whereby the root is going to simply display this message index page. The next thing we need to do is put some code into students.js. This again is going to use the Express package for the library, use the router, and it's going to set a route /students, and this will simply display a message students API. Because we're going to be using EJS, we know that when you use any view engine, the actual files that pertain to that view engine, they have to reside in a views directory. So we need to create here a views directory. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I shall call it views. And in this folder, I'm going to create two files. One is going to be called index.ejs for the main view, and another one would be called layout.ejs, and that would be for the template. So I'm going to add here new file, and I'm going to call it index.ejs. And in there, I also need to create another file, which I shall call layout.ejs. I can now test out my application. Let me go to a command prompt in this folder. And run the server. And this is listing on port number 3000 because I'm in a development environment. Open up my browser, go localhost, hit enter, and here I'm getting into the index page. Now, how about if I try API students? When I hit API students, I'm hitting the students API. But note, at this stage, we're not using EJS because we're not rendering any of these pages. And why do I say that? Well, if you go into this file, first of all, the route for index is just slash. The route for students is slash API. And if I go into index here, I'm doing a response send. I'm not doing a response render. If I was using a response render, then yes, I'm using EJS. And the same is true of students. I'm doing a response send, which is not rendered, therefore I'm not using EJS. Now let us change that. Let me go into index.js, comment this out, and do a render instead. So I'm going to go response.render, and I want to render to the index.ejs page, and I want to pass it some data. So I'm going to say I want to pass it title, Express, Mongo. Okay, that's what I want to do with my index. With my EJS pages, these are both empty. So let me start by putting some markup into my layout.ejs. This is going to be holding the top level HTML elements. It's going to display here in the title tag a title that's going to be passed on from the index.js file. And then we have a body section here. This is the injection point where our views, they inject some markup into the layout. Now let us put something into index.ejs. Line 1 indicates that this view is going to use the layout.ejs that we just defined. It's going to display the title in a head1 tag, and then it's just going to say this is from, and also the title. Let us restart our server. So now, if I go to my home page, we're actually displaying the result that's coming from the view. We know that it's a bit of a pain to have to restart the server every so often, so why not just use NodeMon? Now, if you want to install NodeMon, you need to do this. You need to go npm install NodeMon. mon -g in order to install it globally. I don't need to do that because I already have it. So I'm going to say node mon and then server.js, and it should start for me the server. The advantage of this is that every time I make a change, I don't really need to restart the server because node mon will actually restart the server for me. Let me minimize this window just to prove to you that it's actually working. Let's refresh this, and it seems to work. Let's do a small change in my index.js and perhaps put stars on both sides of the string. And if I come here and refresh, I get the stars, which means that indeed the server had restarted when a change was made. Now, let us create documents in Mongo Labs so that we can access that data from Mongo Labs, and we are going to also do the same thing from a local database. So let me go to Mongo Labs by going mlab.com and let me log in. So I already have this database that I created in Mongo Labs. It's called InstituteDB, and I have a bunch of students that I added here in advance. If you want to do the same thing, all you need to do is create a database in Mongo Labs and add these students one by one, and you should be okay. Now, in order to talk to this database, I need to grab this connection string. This one is used to remotely connect to Mongo Labs from within an application. So I need this. Let me copy this, and I'll paste it in my application. And where did I have that information? I had it in config index.js. So I'm going to replace this with that connection string. And the username is this, and the password that I'm using is mango. Okay, so let's save this. So here, if we want to talk to Mongo Labs, we have to use this. If we want to talk to a local database, we want to use that. Let's go back to students.js, because in the case of students.js, I indeed want to access that database. So I want to use the Mongo driver. And remember, we installed a package at the very beginning with the Mongo driver, and I'll just remind you of that. When I run this command, we requested that the Mongo driver be installed. Now we want to use this Mongo driver to get to the database. So I'm going to import the MongoJS driver. And I also want to import the configuration file index.js. And the way I do that is I just go var config equals to require, and I want to go back one level and go forward towards the config file. So I need to surround these in quotations. So this is the way to import the configuration file. The next step is, if you go to this config index.js, this is where I want to connect to a database. So let me make a small change. Let me start off by connecting to the remote database and sort of put the word ignore here so that it's not used. And then go back into students.js. I'm going to declare another variable and I'll call it db equal to MongoDBs, and I'm going to get the connection string from the configuration file. So I'm going to go config dot, and notice that IntelliSense here tells me you've got two connection strings. You've got database and you've got database ignore. I just want to use database. Dot database. And I'm going to specify the collection that I'm interested in. The collection I'm interested in is called students. This should give me a handle to the database. Back in the students.js file, I want to create an endpoint that will retrieve for me my students. I already have an endpoint that retrieves students, but this just doesn't do anything. It just sends back some static information. We want it to actually go and get some data. So I'm going to replace this with following. I'm going to say db.student. This is pretty much like a command that you would enter from within Mongo. You'd go db.student.find, and here you have a callback. You could do something like this. And in here, you want to have the condition of an error. If an error happens, you want to simply send a response with that error. So you can say response.json and send back the data. So this is essentially taking your data and spitting it back to the user in its native format. So now let's see what's going to happen. Let's go here and say API/students. And sure enough, boom. It got me the data from where? It got it from Mongo Labs. Pretty fast. Let's do the same thing using the local database and see if that's going to work. So let me try this. Let me go into the config file. Instead of saying database ignore, let me call this local. Database local. And then I can go into my students.js, and instead of going to my database, I'm going to go to database local, which is this one here. And let's see if this is going to work. I'm going to come here, refresh, and soon, sure enough, it picked up the data from the local database. How do we know? If I do it again, if I go back to the Mongo Labs, you will notice that the object IDs are different. Like if I refresh now, this one is 3800. Let me go back to the previous, which is the Mongo Labs. In fact, let's do this. Let me go in here and make _mlab here so that we have a distinction. I go now to my students.json and use mlab instead. And I refresh here, you will see that these object IDs are different. Tim Burke. You see, even though the names are the same, the object IDs are different. So this is really coming from Mongo Labs. Because in every database, they generate different object IDs, not the same. So now we learned how we can simply create a web API that spits out JSON with data that comes from MongoDB. And it really doesn't matter where that MongoDB resides. You can get at it. Now let us add another route in our students.js file. And the other route is, suppose I want to get a student by ID. And what I'm suggesting here is, suppose I want to do this. I'm going to grab this, copy it, and I want to do something of this nature. I want to enter the object ID here and request that I get one response for one student. So let's add that. Now, in order to get one student, we need to add another route. We're going to take this and paste it in students.js here. And what this does is it says, if you have a parameter that's coming through, and this is the way you identify a parameter, :ID, then you're going to call the find one function of students, pass it the ID, and then you have a callback here. Just like we did before, if you have an error, then you just spit out that error. Otherwise, display the data, and it's pretty much the same as what we did down here in the previously, same thing. So now let's test it out. If you do this, let's go first of all and display all the data that we have. And let's say I want to display Judy Roy. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. And there goes, I find this one student, Judy Roy. What remains are the other CRUD operations. Let's find out how we can update, insert, and delete. So I'm going to copy all of this and come down here and display all of them. Now here you can expect that you have 3 more routes. Post is to do with inserting or creating a student. Because we're using body parser, we can grab from the request object the body, or essentially the data coming in from a form. Now, if you look at the property of the data that I have, let's just have a quick look at it. Looking at all the students that I have here. Some of the things that I store, or some of the things that are included in the data, is the start date. Now, I don't want to save unless there is a valid start date. So if there is no start date, I'm going to default it to today's date. And if the data coming through has no first name, or has no last name, or has no school, then I'm going to respond with a status 400, meaning bad data. Otherwise, I'm going to save the student object. In the process of saving, if there is an error, I shall display that error. Otherwise, I'm going to return with the new object that was created. Now, deletion is always the easiest thing to do. If you're deleting something, all you need to pass is the object ID. So to delete an object or a document, you send the object ID. In the collection of students, you call the remove method and you pass it the object ID. And you have a callback here. If there's an error, you display the error. Otherwise, you send back data. And in this case, the data would be the response from MongoDB saying it indeed has deleted something. If you want to put, you need to do two things. In the route, you need to pass the object ID. You need to pass the data. And here I'm declaring a variable with an empty JSON object. Now, if the form has first name data, then I'm going to assign that first name data to this change student.firstname. If there's some last name information, I'm going to also assign it to change student last name. If there's any school that has changed, I'll do the same thing for school. If there's any date that has changed, I'll do the same thing for date. If none of these have changed, so the user has sent a put request with no data, in that case, change student will have no value. It will still be an empty JSON object. In that case, I'm going to respond with the status 400, which is bad data. Otherwise, if indeed something has changed, some of those fields have changed, then I'm going to use the update method of MongoDB, access a specific object ID, and pass on the change student data. And then there's a callback here. If there's an error, I'll display the error. Otherwise, I'll respond with the data coming from the database. So now, let us find out if these indeed work. So, the best way to find out without having to build a client-based application is to use a tool called Postman. A short while ago, you could go into the Google Store and download Postman that sort of runs in a browser. But recently, they have completely detached that app from the browser. So you have to literally go and install Postman by downloading the application. So I'm going to go into Google here and search for Postman app. download. And here it is. I will download the Windows version of this application, and let's install it. I'm going to click at the bottom here saying take me straight to the app. I'll create an account another time. And I'll close this window, and our application is still running. So let's just do a get here to see that it's working. So I can go HTTP localhost 3000. This is displaying for me the home page, but I'm not really interested in the home page. I'm interested in the API. So I'll go API/students, which is this. So I can see all my students. I hit enter, and sure enough, I get my 4 students. Now let me do an insert. To do an insert, maybe the easiest way is to take one of these and repurpose them. So I'm going to copy this into Notepad. Of course, when I'm inserting, I don't need to insert an ID because ID is automatically generated. So I'm going to break this up so that it's more legible. And if you remember, I don't even need to enter a date because it will default to today's date if I don't enter a date. So let's say the first name is Gregory and the last name is Lincoln and the school is Transportation. So let us add this. I'm going to take this, copy it, and in Postman, I'll create a new tab. And as far as the method is concerned, because I want to insert, I shall choose post. And I'm going to produce some body data. And I shall choose row. Row is so that I can send some row JSON. So I have to go http://localhost 3000/API/students. The address would be exactly as what we used to do a get. You want to point to that endpoint, but you're going to use the post verb to post the data to that endpoint. So let's see if this is going to work. Send, and we have an error. Error that I experienced is because my endpoint, the post method, is student when I was requesting students. So that's why this thing is not working. Let's try again. I'm going to go back in here and send again. It says bad data could not be inserted in the database. I need to select JSON here so that Postman sends this header. So let's try now. And now it works. And we get an ID. So now let's try something else. Let's get by ID. And I'm going to go and get this particular ID. And yes, that works too. And we have Gregory Lincoln. Now let's do an update. If we want to do an update, we need to do a put. So I'm going to take this and do a put. And here I'm going to choose row, and before I forget, I'm going to change this so that it's JSON format. Paste this, and I'm missing a brace here, open brace. Now when I do a put, I have to pass the ID in my put. So this is my put. I'm going to do that. Go to the same endpoint, pass the ID, and let me do a change here. So let's say Michael Jones, and this is in the School of Nursing. So this should update. Let me send. And this is what we got. This is the data that was sent back. It says modified 1, OK 1, which means yes, indeed, it has been modified. Let's prove that. Let me go to the last request, which brings by ID. And let me do a send again. And this time we have Michael Jones. Finally, let us delete this record here. So we want to delete by ID. So I'm going to copy this and create a new tab for deletion. And I'm going to go against the same endpoint. And then let's go API students / and this ID. So now doing this shows me yes, it's been deleted. Now, if I go back here and I request the same thing, null, meaning this does not exist. I've deleted it. And if I go down here and bring in, this is the first request, if I bring in all my records, I don't have that last one. And I think that was my... Lastly, let us look at another issue that might crop up when you are dealing with APIs. And the problem that might crop up is an issue to do with cross-origin resource sharing. I'm going to insert another folder here if I haven't done so already. I want to insert a static file. Now, in our server.js here, we mentioned that static files are going to be served from this directory. I can add a static file here. So I shall add an index.html file right here. New file, index.html. Going to take all of this, copy, and paste it here. In fact, let me not call it index.html. Let it be something else. I'll rename this to say show.html. So it's not the default page. Because if I left it as index.html, I couldn't get into my index page. Let me give it another name. Now, if I go now to my application and say localhost show.html, this, I should hit that endpoint. And basically what this HTML page does is it uses jQuery to make a request for that data at that endpoint, and it works. There is no problem. The reason there is no problem is, according to the security model of the way JavaScript works and the way these APIs are served by server applications, is that if the request comes from the same domain as the page, then there is no problem. Let me show you where you might have a problem. I'm going to request this using another port number, which in a sense becomes equivalent to another domain. So here I'm going to use another web server to make a request for this page. I shall use Visual Studio, and it doesn't really matter what you use. I'm going to use Visual Studio just to be different. So it's being requested from another port number. Now in Visual Studio, I'm going to create a new project. And it's just going to be a web application. I'll put it somewhere close to the other app that we created. And I'm just going to call it client app. And it's just going to be an empty website in terms of Visual Studio. Now here, I'm going to add an HTML page. And I shall call it index.html. And I'll take the same code that I had before and put it here. Now, if you look at this code, basically, this is jQuery, and it's got a button. This is a button. When the button is clicked, it's going to call this function called getStudents. And this function is going to make a request, a GET request to this endpoint. And regardless of the outcome, it's going to call a function called showResponse. And showResponse is going to take the data that comes through and display it into this element as text. Let me run this. View in browser. We're going to make a request in Chrome using an incognito window. So let me paste the endpoint here. And this is the endpoint that is going to be served by IIS. Different port number from what we're using on the server. Server is listening to 3000. And this app is going to make a request on 3000. So if we hit enter here and click on get student, we're going to get an error. And if you hit 12, what does this tell us? It tells us that we have an access control allow origin problem. That the server is not allowing cross-origin resource sharing. And how do we fix that? Well, the clue is that this is something that the server has to allow. It's not something that the client has to allow. The server has to say, yes, I allow this. And the server can allow it in a number of ways. The server can say, for example, only specific IP addresses are allowed to access my service. Or specific verbs are accepted, i.e. get, post, put, or delete. Or it can even say specific headers are required to access that service. So how do we fix this? Let's go back to our server application, and we can guess that it has something to do with this main app, the server.js. So what we need to do is enable course. We want to take this code and put it right here. And the reason you put it right here is before any endpoint is accessed, we need to allow access control. This is the code that you enter here to say that you add a header, access control, allow origin, and you say star, and the star means any verb, any header, any IP address. You can break that down if you want to. And then you add also another header here to say that you accept all content types. Having done this, let's see that our application hasn't crashed and it's running okay. Now the test of this particular issue is to go back to our incognito window, close this. We don't even need to make a refresh on the client app because it has nothing to do with the client app. It has to do with the server. So if I say get students, sure enough, we get our students. I hope you got value out of this video, and I hope to see you soon in some other of my recordings. Thank you very much.